Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
The DNA lab retested Abraham Lincoln's mother's blood sample 4 times because the result they kept getting back made no scientific sense. What they found buried inside Nancy Hanks's genetic code was a marker so rare it appears in fewer than 1 in every 2,000 people on Earth. Nobody knows exactly where it comes from. Nobody expected to find it in the bloodline of America's most mythologized president. But the deeper scientists dug, the more disturbing it became. Because this wasn't just a strange genetic anomaly. It was proof that the official story of who Nancy Hanks really was, where she came from, and what Lincoln himself privately suspected about his own mother, had been quietly buried for over 2 centuries. And what that buried truth reveals will change the way you see Abraham Lincoln entirely. The woman history forgot her name was Nancy Hanks. She was born on February 5, 1784 in Virginia. She married Thomas Lincoln in 1806 in Washington County, Kentucky. She gave birth to Abraham Lincoln on February 12, 1809 in a 1-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. And she died on October 5, 1818 at just 34 years old, when her son was 9 years old and the world had not yet decided he mattered. That's the official record. 4 dates. That's nearly everything the history books could find. Think about what that absence means. A woman who gave birth to the man who would free 4 million enslaved people lived and died so far outside the reach of documentation that we can't confirm where she came from, who her parents were, or whether anyone considered her story worth writing down. In the early 1800s, frontier Kentucky was not a place that kept careful records of poor women, and Nancy Hanks was very poor. Living in a world that had no particular interest in what she knew, or where she came from, or what she carried in her blood. But here's what that world couldn't erase. The one thing poverty and obscurity and 200 years of myth-making cannot touch. The one thread that runs from Nancy Hanks through her mother and her mother's mother, and all the way back to wherever this family actually came from. Her DNA. And that's exactly where things get disturbing. Because even by 19th century standards, the gaps in Nancy's record are not random. They appear in precisely the places you'd expect them to appear if someone was deliberately hiding something. Almost everything about her origins, who her parents were, whether she was born legitimate or illegitimate, has been the subject of fierce academic combat for more than 150 years. Birth certificates did not exist in Kentucky in the late 1700s. Family Bibles were filled out from memory decades after the fact. Oral traditions contradicted each other in ways that made the truth nearly impossible to pin down. The disturbing part isn't that the record is incomplete. It's that her son, the most powerful man in America, clearly knew why, and told exactly one person. What Lincoln told his law partner William Herndon was Abraham Lincoln's law partner for 16 years. He knew Lincoln better than almost anyone outside the immediate family. And after the assassination, Herndon spent years tracking down every person who had ever known Lincoln. Neighbors, relatives, childhood friends, trying to build the most honest account of the president's life anyone had ever attempted. What Herndon published in 1889 detonated like a bomb. According to Herndon, Lincoln had told him something in private, something he never said publicly, something he specifically asked Herndon to keep secret while he was still alive. The quote went exactly like this: "Billy, I will tell you something, but keep it a secret while I live. My mother was a bastard, was the daughter of a nobleman, so-called, of Virginia. My mother's mother was poor and credulous, and she was shamefully taken advantage of by the man. My mother inherited his qualities, and I hers. All that I am, or ever hope to be, I get from my mother. God bless her. When that quote went public, the reaction was ferocious. Newspapers called it slander. Historians accused Herndon of fabricating the story to sell books. For generations, the claim was dismissed outright. But Herndon was not the only one saying this. Multiple independent sources, people who actually knew the Lincoln family in Kentucky, described Nancy as illegitimate. Neighbors told interviewers that everyone in the area knew her mother, a woman named Lucy Hanks, had given birth to her out of wedlock. Court records confirm Nancy was raised not by her biological mother, but by relatives. And most telling of all, when Nancy married Thomas Lincoln in 1806, the marriage document was signed by a man named Richard Berry Jr. as her legal guardian. That detail matters enormously. A guardian signature would not have been required if Nancy were simply a normal adult woman in full legal standing. Something about her status demanded it. And that paper trail suggests Lincoln wasn't lying to Herndon. He was telling the truth about a family secret buried for decades. A secret that pointed straight back to Nancy's mother, Lucy Hanks, and the question of where Lucy actually came from. Which is where this story gets genuinely strange. The Lucy Hanks problem. Here's what historians could agree on. Nancy's mother was a woman named Lucy Hanks, who later married Henry Sparrow in 1790 in Mercer County, Kentucky, and had 8 more legitimate children. That much was settled. The fight, the real 100-year academic war, was over who Lucy herself actually was. And here's what none of them had a clean answer for. 2 completely incompatible theories had dominated the debate for over a century. And the documentary evidence was too shredded, too contradictory, too conveniently incomplete to settle it. Theory 1 said Lucy was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Anne Nancy Lee, legitimate members of a Virginia farming family with traceable English roots. Theory 2 claimed Lucy was actually born Lucy Shipley, the daughter of a man named Robert Shipley, from an entirely different family line, a different social class, and a different ethnic background. These were not minor variations in the same story. They described 2 different women, 2 different ancestries, 2 completely different explanations for where Nancy Hanks, and therefore Abraham Lincoln, actually came from. For over 100 years, genealogists fought it out using land deeds, marriage records, and family Bibles. Every time one side gained traction, new contradictions surfaced. The documentary trail was so damaged, so deliberately sparse in all the wrong places, that the question seemed permanently unsolvable. Every expert who tried to close it ran into the same wall. And consider what that opacity protected. If Lucy's ancestry was the key to understanding Nancy, and Nancy was the key to understanding Lincoln, then whoever or whatever kept Lucy's origins obscured for 150 years also kept the truth about the most scrutinized family in American history, buried beneath a pile of contradictory land deeds and memory-fogged family Bibles. That is not a coincidence. That is a razor doing exactly what a razor is designed to do. Then someone decided to stop looking at documents entirely and went straight to the blood. The DNA study that changed everything. In 2015, genealogist Susan Hallstrom, working with the Hanks DNA project at Family Tree DNA, had been sitting with years of accumulated research files when she made the decision that would upend 150 years of Lincoln genealogy. She was done waiting for a paper trail that might not exist. The strategy was elegant. Mitochondrial DNA passes directly from mother to child in an unbroken maternal line. It doesn't recombine. It doesn't shuffle. It travels identically from grandmother to mother to daughter across hundreds of generations without changing. Which means it's a perfect archive of maternal ancestry, stretching back further than any document could reach. If Hallstrom could identify living maternal descendants of Lucy Hanks Sparrow and compare their DNA to descendants of the two Shipley sisters, Naomi Shipley, who married Robert Mitchell, and Rachel Shipley, who married Richard Berry Sr., the results would be definitive. No interpretation required. No conflicting testimony. Just biology. Tracking down those living descendants took years. Genealogical detective work across multiple states, multiple family lines, multiple dead ends. But eventually, the samples were collected, the sequencing was complete, and on October 21st, 2015, Hallstrom's team announced results that stopped the genealogical community cold. The descendants of Lucy Hanks Sparrow, Abraham Lincoln's direct maternal line, all returned the same marker. The descendants of the Shipley sisters returned a completely different one. Not similar, not overlapping. Completely different haplogroups. The DNA proved conclusively that Lucy Hanks was not Lucy Shipley. She was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Anne Nancy Lee. The century-long debate was over, but closing that door blew open another one. Because nobody in that room was prepared for what Lincoln's maternal haplogroup actually was, and what it meant that it had survived, invisible, inside the most studied family in American history for over 200 years. Subscribe right now. Because what that haplogroup reveals about who Nancy Hanks really was and where her family actually came from is the reason geneticists are still working this case in 2026. And what's coming next will change the way you think about Lincoln entirely. Haplogroup X1C, the rarest signature on Earth. Dr. Marcus Chen, a population geneticist at the University of Chicago's Department of Human Genetics, was 3 hours into a review session in early 2025 when he pulled up the Hanks DNA file and flagged the same result for the 4th time. He'd been cross-referencing it against global haplogroup databases for the better part of an afternoon. Databases containing millions of records from populations across every continent. He'd run the comparison twice already that session. Each time, the number came back the same. He leaned back, stared at the screen, and then did something unusual for a man who spends his days reading genetic data without blinking. He picked up the phone and called a colleague. Here's what had stopped him. Haplogroup X1C, the specific mitochondrial marker carried by Abraham Lincoln's maternal line, appears in less than 0.05% of the global population. Let that land for a second. Test 10,000 people at random, and you might find 5 who carry it. When Hallstrom's team first returned that result in 2015, they assumed lab error. They retested, and retested again. Every result came back identical. This was not a data glitch. This was real. And here's the part that genuinely baffled Chen and his colleagues. Nobody fully knows where X1C comes from. Haplogroup X itself is already unusual. Found in small frequencies across parts of Europe, the Middle East, and, controversially, in certain Native American populations. A geographic distribution that has never been fully explained, and has generated its own decades of academic argument. But X1C is a rare subclade within X that operates on a completely different level of strangeness. It appears in scattered individuals across Europe, but never in large, cohesive populations. It has never been confirmed in Native American populations, despite years of systematic searching. Its precise geographic origin point is genuinely unknown. Some geneticists believe X1C originated in the Near East thousands of years ago. Others think it may be a remnant signature of a now extinct European population. People who lived, reproduced, and died without leaving any other genetic traces in the modern record. A kind of ghost lineage, visible only in these rare, scattered carriers. A few researchers have proposed connections to ancient migration patterns that predate recorded history entirely. Here's what none of them can agree on, and here's what none of them dispute. Wherever X1C came from, it was not typical colonial American stock. This was not a standard English or Scots-Irish settler family spreading across Virginia and Kentucky in the 1600s. The Hanks maternal line was carrying something else, something rare, something ancient, something pointing toward origins that appear nowhere in the official story of who this family claimed to be. That is a disturbing discovery, and the longer you sit with it, the more disturbing it gets. Because the rarity alone doesn't fully explain what made Chen pick up the phone. It was the location of it. An American frontier family. A one-room log cabin in Kentucky. The maternal line of the most documented man in United States history. This haplogroup had no business being there. And it gets more disturbing when you understand what that rarity actually means for Nancy Hanks, the woman at the center of this entire story. What the rarity means for Nancy Hanks. Let's put the X1C frequency in real context, because the number alone doesn't do it justice. Common European haplogroups like H and HV appear in 40 to 50% of Western populations. Haplogroup J, already considered relatively uncommon, still appears in roughly 10% of people with Middle Eastern or Mediterranean ancestry. Even haplogroups that geneticists classify as rare typically appear in at least 1 or 2% of any given population. Haplogroup X itself, the broad parent category, appears in approximately 4% of Europeans and roughly 3% of Native Americans. And X1C is a subclade within that already uncommon group. Less than 0.05%. We are not talking about a slightly unusual result from a family with atypical roots. We are talking about one of the smallest, most geographically scattered genetic subgroups that population scientists have ever reliably identified. And it was sitting undetected in the maternal bloodline of Abraham Lincoln. Now go back to what Lincoln told Herndon. His mother's mother, Lucy Hanks, was seduced by a Virginia nobleman who took advantage of a poor and credulous woman. If that account is accurate, Lucy's mother didn't come from typical colonial stock. She came from somewhere with a genetic lineage so rare that 240 years later, it would trigger a series of panicked retests in a professional genetics lab. A lineage so anomalous that Dr. Marcus Chen, a man who reads haplogroup data for a living, felt compelled to call a colleague before he'd even written up his notes. Researchers working on the 2025 reanalysis proposed several possible origins for the X1C signature. And this is where it gets genuinely strange. Because every theory they proposed describes a group that faced discrimination severe enough to make erasing their own history a survival strategy. Some pointed to Middle Eastern or Mediterranean ancestry several generations back, heritage that would have been deeply stigmatized in colonial Virginia and given a family a powerful motivation to pass as something else. Others pointed to Sephardic Jewish ancestry, families who had publicly converted during the Spanish Inquisition, but maintained their true genetic lineage through generations of deliberate concealment, passing their identity from mother to daughter like a secret that couldn't be spoken aloud. A third group of researchers raised Romani ancestry, A people who had spent centuries developing sophisticated strategies for passing undetected across every country they entered. Because visibility meant persecution. None of these can be confirmed from the X1C signature alone. But here's what every single one of these theories shares. They all describe people who survived by hiding. People whose stories weren't lost by accident. They were deliberately erased. People whose descendants learned, over generations, that the truth was dangerous, and that silence was the price of survival. Nancy Hanks may have descended from exactly those people. She may have carried that history in her blood without ever knowing what it meant. Or she may have known and done what her ancestors did. Buried it, said nothing, passed it forward, just as her son would do after her. The silence of the President Herndon wrote that Lincoln seldom spoke about his family's history. There was, Herndon noted, something about his origins that he never cared to dwell upon. That observation has a completely different weight now. Consider what we know about this man's relationship with words. Lincoln wrote obsessively. He kept meticulous records. He answered almost every letter he received, even during the war, when White House correspondence was overwhelming. He was famous, is still famous, for the extraordinary precision of his language, the care he brought to every public word. The Gettysburg Address is 272 words. The second inaugural is 703. Every syllable chosen, weighted, placed. This was not a man who let important things slip past him unexamined. And yet, on the subject of his mother's origins, on the family secret he had confided to Herndon, he chose absolute public silence for the entirety of his political life. That is not the behavior of a man with nothing to hide. That is the behavior of a man who understood exactly what the truth would cost him. His political rivals already knew how to weaponize ancestry. During his campaigns, opponents called him a mulatto. They called him Abraham Africanus I. They spread rumors specifically designed to cast doubt on his racial identity and disqualify him in the eyes of white voters. In that environment, any confirmed non-Anglo-Saxon maternal heritage, Jewish, Romani, Mediterranean, anything outside the acceptable mainstream, would have been politically lethal. Not damaging, lethal. Lincoln's silence was not reluctance. It was strategy. It worked. But the disturbing discovery it was protecting didn't disappear. It waited, encoded in the cells of his living descendants, for a technology that didn't exist yet. For a woman named Susan Hallstrom sitting in her home office in 2015 to find it. What the DNA confirms and what it cannot answer. Here is where things stand in 2026. DNA testing has proved conclusively that Lucy Hanks was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Anne Nancy Lee, not the Shipley family. That debate is permanently, definitively closed. Abraham Lincoln's maternal line carries haplogroup X1C, appearing in fewer than 0.05% of the global population, fewer than 1 in 2,000 people worldwide. That rarity confirms that Nancy Hanks's ancestors were not typical colonial Americans. They were something rarer, something specific, something that doesn't match the story the Hanks family presented to the world, and Lincoln's own private confession to Herndon that his mother was illegitimate, descended from a Virginia planter who took advantage of a poor woman, now has hard genetic evidence standing directly behind it. But what the DNA cannot tell us is which hidden ancestry produced the X1C signature. And that uncertainty is its own kind of disturbing discovery. The researchers working on the 2025 reanalysis, Dr. Chen's team at the University of Chicago, cross-referencing global haplogroup databases were not fringe theorists or amateur genealogists. These were professional population geneticists, people who spend their careers reading this kind of data without flinching. When they described the X1C result as unlike anything they expected to find in an American frontier family from the early 1800s, that wasn't drama. That was precision. The specific shock of people who have cataloged millions of haplogroup records suddenly encountering one that refuses to fit. Was it Sephardic Jewish heritage, carried to Virginia by families who had survived the Inquisition and spent generations perfecting the art of being invisible? Was it Mediterranean or Near Eastern ancestry from a colonial-era group that left almost no documentary records? People who arrived in the New World already fluent in the language of concealment? Was it Romani ancestry, suppressed by the same forces that had been systematically erasing Romani people across Europe for centuries? Or was it something else entirely? A population so thoroughly gone from the historical record that we have no surviving trace of their presence, except the occasional scattered carrier of a rare mitochondrial marker. Those questions may never be fully answered. The 2025 reanalysis opened more doors than it closed. And the fact that these doors are still open, that the most studied man in American history has a maternal bloodline that professional geneticists cannot fully explain, is the most disturbing discovery of all. The bigger picture. Step back from the data for a moment. Abraham Lincoln is the most mythologized figure in American history. The log cabin, the rail splitter, honest Abe, born from humble pioneer stock, rising by pure merit to save the Union. That myth was constructed deliberately. It made Lincoln into the quintessential American story. Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, frontier-forged, a product of the origin narrative this country chose for itself. But the man himself told his closest confidant the story wasn't quite true. His mother was illegitimate. Her ancestry was hidden. Her genetic signature points toward origins that 19th century America would have found deeply threatening. And the man who freed 4 million enslaved people, who preserved the Union at the cost of over 600,000 lives, may himself have descended from exactly the kind of people that 19th century America was most systematically determined to exclude. The president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the man who staked his life on the principle that all men are created equal. He may have understood erasure not as a political abstraction, but as something written into his own blood. Something his mother passed to him across a silence she may not have been able to break, even if she'd wanted to. All that I am, or ever hope to be, I get from my mother. He said that in private to the one person he trusted, with the truth. What we know for certain. Nancy Hanks died at 34 in a small log cabin in Kentucky. She never knew the presidency her son would hold. She never sat in a room where geneticists argued about what her blood meant. She died in a world that kept no records of women like her, and was buried in ground that took decades to properly mark. But the thing about DNA is that it does not cooperate with mythology. It does not bend to the stories powerful people decided to tell. It passes from mother to child in perfect fidelity, through every attempt to erase the people carrying it. The Spanish Inquisition couldn't break that chain. The social pressures of colonial Virginia couldn't break it. The requirements of 19th century American politics couldn't break it. 2 centuries of myth-making about the great emancipator couldn't break it. A genetics laboratory found it in saliva samples from people who had no idea what they were carrying. She passed her son something no myth-making could ever erase. A haplogroup so rare that 2 centuries later, professional geneticists are still retesting samples, still cross-referencing global databases, still unable to place its true origin with certainty. That is her true legacy. Not the log cabin, not the frontier story, not the sanitized chapter in the schoolbook. A genetic signature from somewhere older, somewhere that America spent 200 years pretending wasn't part of the story. As of 2026, here is what the evidence confirms. DNA testing proved conclusively that Lucy Hanks was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Ann Nancy Lee. Abraham Lincoln's maternal line carries haplogroup X1C, one of the rarest genetic markers ever identified in a modern population study. Found in fewer than 1 in 2,000 people worldwide. That rarity confirms that Nancy Hanks's ancestors were not typical colonial Americans. And Lincoln's own private confession to Herndon about a mother born illegitimate and an ancestry deliberately buried now has hard genetic evidence behind every word of it. The DNA does not lie. What it reveals is not a closed case. It is an open wound in the official record. A direct signal, encoded in Nancy Hanks's descendants and undisturbed for over 2 centuries, that the story America told about her son was never the whole truth. More DNA samples are being collected right now. More maternal descendants are being identified and sequenced. Researchers with the Hanks DNA Project believe further analysis could eventually locate the true origin point of X1C. And with it, the identity of the people Nancy Hanks came from. The people she was never permitted to claim. The people whose story died with her in that Kentucky cabin and survived only in the blood she passed to her son. The most powerful man in 19th century America may have descended from the very people that America was most determined to erase. Subscribe right now. Because the investigation into who those people really were and how many other hidden ancestries are buried deep inside the stories we think we know is far from over. We are only just getting started.